The bank statement showed $12.37 when Ryan Mitchell's 6-year-old son asked if they had enough money for lunch at school this week, his voice carrying the quiet resignation of a child who'd learned that basic needs were negotiable depending on circumstances adults controlled but rarely explained. The answer was no, they didn't, but Ryan couldn't bring himself to say it directly, so he made peanut butter sandwiches with bread that was 2 days past expiration and told Ben to save half for tomorrow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ryan sat at the kitchen counter of the motel room they'd been living in for 3 months, the cheapest weekly rate he could find after the eviction, scrolling through job listings on a phone that would be disconnected in 2 days for non-payment. Ben was already at school, walking the mile alone because Ryan couldn't afford gas for a truck he'd sold 4 months ago to pay for Ben's antibiotics when the infection in his ear had gotten bad enough that the emergency room couldn't turn them away. The construction work had dried up when the developer went bankrupt mid-project, leaving Ryan with 6 weeks of unpaid wages and a lawsuit that would take years to resolve if it ever did. The temp agencies weren't calling back, the unemployment office had run out of extensions, and the motel manager had left a note under the door saying they had 1 week to pay the $1,500 they owed or their belongings would be put on the street. He'd already sold everything that could be sold, his tools, his deceased wife's jewelry that should have been saved for Ben, the camping equipment from better days when camping had been recreation rather than a looming possibility. All that remained was the grinding awareness that homelessness was 6 days away and shelters had waiting lists that measured in months, not days. The county foreclosure auction advertisement appeared while he was searching for food banks open on Tuesdays. Riverside Paper Mill, 11. 3 acres including main mill building, water treatment facility, and access road. Minimum bid $400. Property sold as is, significant environmental contamination and structural hazards. The photographs showed a massive industrial complex that looked like something from another era, a 5-story brick building easily 300 feet long, with enormous smokestacks that had once belched steam from pulp processing. The structure had the brutal efficiency of early 20th century industrial architecture, built to process timber into paper on a scale that modern facilities had long since made obsolete. According to county records, the Riverside Mill had been built in 1908 by the Northern Paper Company, had operated continuously through both World Wars and the Depression, processing pulpwood from the surrounding forests into newsprint and writing paper. It had closed in 1994 when environmental regulations and foreign competition made small domestic paper mills economically unviable. Ryan clicked through inspection reports finding language that would have deterred any rational buyer. Chemical contamination from pulp bleaching agents, structural damage from decades of exposure to moisture and industrial processes, asbestos insulation throughout the building, outdated electrical systems that posed significant fire hazards. The property had liens totaling $67,000 for environmental cleanup and back taxes. The mill was toxic, dangerous, and fundamentally worthless to anyone with alternatives. But Ryan was sitting in a motel room with a 6-year-old son in 6 days until homelessness, and $400 was exactly the amount he'd been saving to pay for 1 more week of shelter while he figured out what came next. It was insanity. He knew nothing about industrial properties or paper mills or environmental remediation. But he also knew that owning something, even something poisonous, gave him legal standing to at least be somewhere, to have an address to put on job applications, to tell Ben they had a place instead of admitting they were about to lose even the motel room that smelled of bleach and despair. He spent the evening researching the mill's history, finding newspaper articles about the Northern Paper Company and its founder, a man named Victor Brennan who'd built a timber and paper empire across the Northeast. The mill had been one of several he'd operated, specializing in high-quality paper for books and legal documents when most mills focused on cheaper newsprint. One article from 1993 mentioned the mill's final manager, a man named Samuel Brennan, Victor's grandson, who'd fought to keep the operation viable even as environmental costs and foreign competition drove profit margins to zero. "Some mills are worth more than their balance sheets," Samuel had said in an interview. "This building represents honest work in community employment. Closing it means something dies beyond just a business." The mill had closed anyway, and Samuel Brennan had died 2 years later at 78. The property had bounced through several failed redevelopment attempts before the county seized it for unpaid environmental liens that no one wanted to assume. The auction happened in a conference room at the courthouse, the same building where Ryan had filed for bankruptcy after his wife's cancer treatment had consumed their savings and left them with medical debt that would have taken 30 years to repay. The room held maybe 8 people, most of them looking like scrap dealers hoping to salvage copper wire and equipment from industrial sites. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ryan sat in the back with Ben beside him, explaining quietly that they were bidding on a building that might become their home, at least temporarily. Ben nodded with the seriousness children develop when they understand that adult decisions carry weight they can't fully comprehend but can feel pressing down on everyone. The auctioneer worked through properties efficiently, selling vacant lots and condemned buildings to buyers who knew exactly what they were acquiring and how to profit from demolition. When the paper mill came up, his voice took on the warning tone Ryan had learned to recognize from doctors delivering terminal diagnoses. Property contains significant environmental contamination requiring state-supervised remediation. Building is structurally unsound and unsafe for any occupation. Buyer assumes full liability and approximately $67,000 in environmental liens and back taxes. Minimum bid $400. Ryan raised his hand before courage could fail him, his heart hammering against ribs that seemed too fragile to contain it. $400 from bidder 9. Do I hear $425? Silence filled the room like water filling a drowning man's lungs. Ryan could feel people looking at him, could sense the mixture of pity and judgment from those who recognized desperation when they saw it wearing a man's face. Going once at $400. The auctioneer's voice carried no hope. Going twice. Ryan waited for sanity to intervene, for someone to save him from himself. Sold to bidder 9 for $400. Ben grabbed his father's hand, squeezing hard. We bought it? The mill? Yeah, buddy, Ryan said, his voice not quite steady. We bought the mill. At the clerk's window, he counted out $400 in 20s, money that should have kept them in the motel another week, then added another $50 for filing fees and deed transfer. The clerk was a middle-aged man named Walter who looked at Ryan with the expression of someone who'd processed 1,000 of these transactions and knew which ones were desperation and which were strategy. The Brennan Mill, Walter said, sliding papers across the counter for signature. You know what you're getting into? Not really, no. The environmental contamination is real. State EPA has it listed as a brownfield site requiring monitored cleanup. You can't develop it, can't demolish it without expensive abatement, can't do much of anything without addressing the chemical residue. He paused. But you can be on the property as long as you're not disturbing contaminated areas or exposing yourself to hazardous materials. The main office section was isolated from the pulping operations. That's where you'd want to set up if you're planning to actually use this as shelter. Is it safe? For my son? Walter's expression softened as he noticed Ben coloring with worn crayons at a table nearby. The office building is separate from the processing areas. As long as you're not going into the pulping rooms or the chemical storage sections, you should be okay. But get it inspected by someone who knows industrial sites. My brother-in-law does that work, his card's in the information packet. The drive to the mill took them through Maine countryside that was beautiful in the way abandoned places often are, forests reclaiming logged areas, rivers running clean despite decades of industrial use, small towns showing the scars of economic transitions they hadn't chosen and couldn't control. The mill sat at the edge of Millbrook, a town that had clearly depended on paper manufacturing before the industry moved overseas. Empty storefronts on Main Street, houses with peeling paint, the general atmosphere of communities that had lost their economic foundation and were slowly dissolving into history. From the road, the mill was simultaneously impressive and ominous. 5 stories of red brick, built with the industrial confidence of an era when American manufacturing seemed destined to dominate forever. The smokestacks rose like monuments to obsolete processes. The building stretched along the riverbank, positioned to draw water for pulping operations that had once run 24 hours a day. Up close, the decay was more apparent. Broken windows, graffiti marking failed attempts at urban exploration, sections of roof collapsed where weather had exploited structural weakness. But the office section Walter had mentioned stood separate from the main processing building, a 3-story brick structure that looked more stable than the industrial spaces it had once administered. "It's really big," Ben said quietly, his voice mixing awe with uncertainty. "It is. Way too big for us to use most of it. But we'll find a safe space, make it work for now." They approached carefully, stepping over debris and around rusted equipment that had been cannibalized by scrappers over the years. The office building's door was secured with a padlock, and the key Walter had given Ryan turned smoothly despite 30 years of abandonment. Inside, the office building was remarkably intact. The processing areas might be toxic and collapsed, but the administrative spaces had been built separately, insulated from the chemical and moisture exposure that had destroyed the industrial sections. Desks remained in some rooms, filing cabinets stood against walls, photographs of mill workers from decades past still hung in hallways. The smell was musty but not chemical, old paper and wood rather than the industrial residue Ryan had expected. Windows let an afternoon light that illuminated dust dancing in air that hadn't been disturbed in years. The space felt frozen in time, waiting for workers who would never return to jobs that no longer existed. They climbed to the second floor carefully, Ryan testing each stair before letting Ben follow. Most rooms were empty or filled with abandoned office equipment, but one corner office was larger than the others, with windows overlooking both the river and the industrial sections of the mill. A desk remained, solid oak beneath layers of dust. Filing cabinets lined one wall. And on the wall itself hung a photograph that made Ryan pause, a man in a suit standing in front of the mill at its peak operation, smoke billowing from stacks, workers visible in the background. The brass nameplate beneath identified him as Samuel Brennan, 1950 to 1996. Ben was exploring the room when he found it, a section of wall paneling that hung slightly crooked, revealing a gap behind it that shouldn't exist. Ryan pulled the panel away carefully, finding it had been installed over what appeared to be a steel door, industrial grade, and completely out of place in an administrative office. The door had no visible handle, just a keypad that looked surprisingly modern compared to everything else in the building. And beside the keypad was a small brass plate engraved with words that made Ryan's blood run cold: "Authorized personnel only, Northern Paper Company Document Security Archive, unauthorized access, federal offense." Ryan stood staring at the door, his mind racing through implications he didn't understand. Document archives didn't typically require federal offense warnings. They didn't need industrial-grade steel doors hidden behind wall panels in offices that had been abandoned for 30 years. He pulled out his phone, photographing the door and the warning plate, documenting what they'd found before touching anything else. Ben watched with the quiet attention he brought to things that made his father tense. "What's a federal offense?" Ben asked. "It means breaking federal law. Government law, not just state or local." Ryan examined the keypad more closely, noting that it still had a small LED indicator that glowed faint red, suggesting power despite the building's electricity having been shut off decades ago. Which means whatever's behind this door, someone thought it was important enough to protect with serious consequences. The implications were settling over Ryan like cold water. He'd bought this property for $400 expecting nothing except shelter. But hidden behind a wall in an abandoned paper mill was a secure archive that had federal protection, that apparently still had some kind of power supply, that suggested the building had held purposes beyond simple paper manufacturing. And based on everything he'd learned about desperate situations and complications, whatever was behind that door was either going to save them or destroy them, and he wouldn't know which until it was too late to choose differently. The office waited in afternoon light, dust settling slowly, the building's vast industrial spaces silent beyond these administrative walls. Ryan had purchased the mill because he'd had no other options, because homelessness with a 6-year-old son had seemed worse than taking a chance on toxic property. Now he stood in front of a steel door with a federal warning, holding a deed to a building that had apparently contained secrets for 30 years, understanding that the complications of his life had just escalated into territory he couldn't comprehend. The LED glowed faint red, patient as only security systems can be, waiting for authorization codes that Ryan didn't have, protecting contents he couldn't imagine, standing as guardian to whatever Samuel Brennan had hidden so thoroughly it had survived 3 decades of abandonment and abandonment's patient erosion. Ryan photographed everything one more time, then carefully replaced the wall panel, understanding instinctively that some discoveries required thought before action, that rushing into hidden rooms protected by federal warnings was how desperate people made situations worse instead of better. But he also understood, with the certainty that came from having nothing left to lose, that whatever was behind that door was going to define what happened next, whether they'd found shelter or stumbled into something that would bring exactly the kind of attention people living in abandoned mills couldn't afford. The building creaked in the wind, its industrial bones settling, its secrets waiting with the patience that came from 30 years of successful hiding. Ryan's first instinct was to walk away, to pretend they'd never found the hidden door, to focus on making the office spaces habitable and ignore whatever Samuel Brennan had sealed behind industrial steel and federal warnings. But that instinct lasted exactly as long as it took to remember they had $12 in the bank and 6 days until the motel threw their belongings on the street. Whatever was behind that door might be valuable, might be dangerous, or might be nothing. But not knowing felt worse than the risk of finding out, especially when the alternative was watching Ben go hungry because his father couldn't afford school lunches. That evening, after setting up camping gear in the cleanest office space he could find, Ryan waited until Ben was asleep before returning to examine the door more carefully. The keypad glowed its faint red, powered by something Ryan couldn't locate, no visible battery compartment, no wiring leading to it. The technology looked out of place against the 1990s-era office equipment surrounding it, suggesting someone had installed modern security on an older archive. He photographed the door from every angle, searching online for information about Northern Paper Company and document archives and federal security requirements. What he found was unsettling. Paper mills occasionally produced classified documents under government contracts, currency paper for the Treasury, secure forms for intelligence agencies, specialized materials for military applications. But those contracts were heavily monitored, and the facilities that held them had security measures that extended beyond simple locked doors. A historical database revealed something more specific. Northern Paper had held contracts with the Department of Defense in the 1980s and early 1990s, producing secure document paper for classified materials. The contracts had ended when the mill closed, but the secure storage requirements apparently hadn't. Which meant whatever was in that archive had been important enough to seal rather than remove, to protect with federal warnings rather than simply transport to another secure location. Ryan sat in the dark office thinking about implications that made his skin crawl with unease. If the government had sealed classified materials in this building and then abandoned them for 30 years, it meant either they'd forgotten about them, unlikely, or they'd decided the materials were too sensitive or too dangerous to move and had left them in place under security they assumed no one would breach. And he'd just purchased the building for $400, which made him legally responsible for whatever was inside. His phone rang at 7 a.m., a number he didn't recognize. Ryan answered cautiously, Ben still sleeping in the camping bag beside him. "Mr. Mitchell?" A woman's voice, professional and direct. "My name is Agent Sarachin with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm calling about the property you purchased yesterday at county auction. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss certain materials that may be located on the premises." Ryan felt his stomach drop. Less than 24 hours after buying the mill, the FBI was calling. "How did you know I bought it?" "We maintain alerts on certain properties of interest. The Riverside Mill is one of them." Her tone remained neutral but carried weight. "I want to be clear, you're not in any trouble at this point. But we need to have a conversation about what you may have found and about federal obligations regarding classified materials." "I haven't found anything. Just a building that's mostly collapsed." "Mr. Mitchell, if you've explored the administrative offices, you've likely encountered a secure door with federal warnings. I need you to confirm that you haven't attempted to access that door or its contents." The specificity told Ryan they knew exactly what was in the building, had probably been monitoring it remotely despite 30 years of abandonment. I found a door. Didn't try to open it. But I need to understand what I bought and what obligations come with it. That's what we need to discuss. I can meet you at the property this afternoon. 2 o'clock. And Mr. Mitchell, don't attempt to access the secure area before we talk. The consequences for unauthorized access to classified materials are severe, regardless of property ownership. After she hung up, Ryan sat with his phone and shaking hands, understanding that whatever he'd stumbled into was far more complicated than an abandoned mill. Ben woke up asking if they had breakfast, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a child who'd learned not to expect much. Ryan made oatmeal on the camping stove, using the last of the instant packets he'd bought at a dollar store. We have a visitor coming this afternoon. A federal agent who wants to talk about the building. I need you to stay quiet and let me handle the conversation, okay? Are we in trouble? No, buddy. But the building has some complicated history, and we need to understand what that means for us. Before Agent Chen arrived, Ryan explored more of the office building, finding filing cabinets that still held documents from the mill's final years. Production records, employee files, financial statements that showed the operation bleeding money as foreign competition and environmental costs made domestic paper production economically unviable. But he also found something else, a locked drawer in Samuel Brennan's desk that he managed to pry open with a screwdriver. Inside was a leather journal, its pages filled with Samuel's handwriting documenting the mill's final years. Ryan read entries that showed a man watching his family's legacy die, fighting to keep employees working even as the business failed, making choices that prioritized people over profit until there was no profit left to sacrifice. One entry from November 1993 carried particular weight: the DoD contract ends this month. They're removing most of the classified production equipment, but they've decided to leave the document archive in place rather than transport it. The materials are too sensitive to move, they claim, too dangerous to destroy, so they'll simply seal the vault and monitor it indefinitely. I argued that sealing classified materials in a failing mill was insane, that this building will be abandoned within months. They assured me the vault has independent power and security, that it will remain protected regardless of the building's status. I made them put that in writing. If this mill becomes my family's liability after I'm gone, I want documentation that the government chose to leave their problems here. Ryan photographed the journal entry, understanding that Samuel had known exactly what complications he was leaving behind, had tried to protect future owners by documenting the government's decision. The archive wasn't Samuel's responsibility, it was federal property that had been deliberately left in place despite the mill's impending closure. Agent Chen arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, driving an unmarked sedan. She was maybe 40, carrying herself with the controlled precision of someone used to dealing with situations that required both authority and discretion. A second agent accompanied her, a man she introduced as Agent Marcus Torres. They examined Ryan's documentation without speaking: the deed, the auction receipt, Samuel Brennan's journal entry about the sealed vault. Chen's expression showed professional neutrality, but Ryan caught the slight tightening around her eyes when she read Samuel's account of the government's decision to leave classified materials in a closing mill. Samuel Brennan documented his objections to leaving the archive here, Chen said finally. That's helpful for establishing that you're not responsible for its presence. But I'm responsible for whatever happens to it now that I own the building. Technically, no. The archive remains federal property under the terms of the original security agreement. You own the building, but the government retains rights to the sealed materials. She paused. However, your purchase of the property has created a complication. The archive was secure while the building was abandoned and monitored remotely. Now that it's occupied, we need to reassess the security situation. Meaning what? Agent Torres spoke for the first time, his voice less diplomatic than Chen's. Meaning we need to verify the vault's contents, confirm that nothing's been compromised, and determine whether the materials need to be relocated now that unauthorized personnel have access to the building. I haven't accessed anything. Haven't even tried. We believe you, Chen said, though her tone suggested belief was provisional. But we need to open the vault and conduct an inventory. That process will require you to vacate the property for approximately 72 hours while our team works. Ryan felt something cold settle in his chest. I bought this building because I'm 6 days from homelessness with a 6-year-old son. I don't have another place to go while you conduct your inventory. Chen's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been sympathy. Mr. Mitchell, I understand your situation is difficult. But the materials in that vault are classified at the highest levels. Their exposure could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and endanger lives. We can't allow unsecured access while we verify their status. Then what am I supposed to do? I spent my last $400 buying this property because it was the only thing between my son and a homeless shelter. The silence that followed was heavy with implications Ryan didn't want to examine. Chen and Torres exchanged glances that spoke of protocols and regulations and the unfortunate reality that federal security requirements didn't bend for personal hardship. There may be options, Chen said finally. If the vault's contents are confirmed secure and haven't been compromised, and if the materials can be safely left in place, we could establish a formal security agreement that allows you to remain on the property. But that requires verification first, which requires you to vacate during the inventory. And if I refuse? It's my property. I haven't broken any laws. Torres's expression hardened. If you refuse to cooperate with a federal security verification, we can obtain a court order requiring access. That process makes things more complicated and more expensive for everyone. We're trying to handle this cooperatively. Ryan looked at Ben, who sat quietly in the corner of the office coloring with the worn crayons that represented most of his possessions. His son was watching the adults with the careful attention children develop when they understand that their lives are being decided by conversations they're not part of. I need 24 hours to figure out where we can go, Ryan said. And I need assurance that after your inventory, if everything's secure, we can return to live here. We can agree to those terms, Chen said, though her tone suggested she was making concessions that might complicate her own situation. But Mr. Mitchell, you need to understand something. The materials in that vault are related to operations that ended 30 years ago, but their sensitivity hasn't diminished. If anyone, yourself, your son, anyone else, attempts to access that vault before or after our inventory, the consequences are severe. Federal prison severe. After they left, Ryan stood in Samuel Brennan's office holding papers that made him legal owner of a building that contained federal secrets he couldn't touch, wondering how desperation had led him to a place where buying shelter meant accepting responsibility for classified materials he'd never asked for and didn't want. Ben appeared beside him, his small hand finding Ryan's. Are they going to take our building? No, buddy. They just need to check something inside it, make sure it's safe. Then we can come back. Where will we go while they check? Ryan didn't have an answer immediately. The motel was no longer an option. They'd missed the payment deadline and their belongings had been put in storage they couldn't afford to claim. His parents were dead, his wife's family had cut contact after her death, and friends had drifted away during the 2 years of medical crisis and financial collapse. He called the number Walter had given him, the clerk's brother-in-law who did industrial inspections. The man's name was Tom Brennan, and when he answered, his voice carried surprise at hearing from Ryan so quickly. The FBI just left, Ryan said without preamble. Told me I need to vacate for 72 hours while they verify contents of a classified vault I didn't know existed when I bought this building. You're related to the family that owned the mill. Did you know about the archive? Tom was quiet for a long moment. Samuel was my uncle. I knew he'd held DoD contracts, knew the government had sealed something in the building when it closed. But I was 15 when the mill shut down, didn't understand the details. After Samuel died, the property bounced through so many hands that I figured if there were classified materials, the government had removed them years ago. They didn't. And now they're making me leave while they inventory whatever Samuel left sealed. Where will you go? I don't know. That's why I'm calling. I'm hoping you might know someone who'd let us stay temporarily, or have suggestions for how to manage this situation. Tom was quiet again, and Ryan could hear the kind of thinking that involved weighing obligations against convenience. Finally, Tom said, "You can stay with my family. We've got a spare room, my wife won't mind, and it's the least I can do considering Samuel probably should have warned someone this complication would follow the property." Relief flooded through Ryan so intensely it made his eyes burn. "I can't afford to pay you. Didn't ask you to. You bought a building my uncle left booby-trapped with federal problems. Consider this penance for family decisions I wasn't part of but inherited anyway." Ryan and Ben moved their few belongings to Tom's house that evening, a modest ranch home that felt impossibly spacious after months in a motel room. Tom's wife Helen was a nurse who understood hardship and didn't ask questions that would have required Ryan to explain how thoroughly his life had collapsed. Their teenage daughter showed Ben her room and offered to share her tablet for games, simple kindness that made Ben smile for the first time in weeks. That night, after Ben was asleep in the guest room, Ryan sat with Tom in the kitchen drinking coffee that tasted expensive compared to the instant powder Ryan had been rationing. "Samuel kept journals," Tom said. "After he died, they went to my mother, his sister. She passed 5 years ago, and her belongings are still in storage. If you want to understand what Samuel was dealing with, what the government sealed in that mill, those journals might explain it. The FBI said I can't access the vault. I'm not talking about accessing anything. I'm talking about understanding what you bought and what obligations come with it." Tom pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "My mother's storage unit is in Portland. I've got a key. If you want to look through Samuel's papers, that's your business. Just be aware that what you learn might not make anything easier." They drove to Portland the next morning, Ben staying with Helen who'd offered to take him to the library. The storage unit was climate-controlled, filled with furniture and boxes that represented a lifetime of accumulated belongings no one had wanted enough to keep but couldn't bring themselves to dispose of. Tom found Samuel's papers in boxes marked with his name, journals and documents spanning from the 1960s through his death in 1996. Ryan sat on the storage unit's concrete floor reading through decades of Samuel Brennan's documented struggle to keep a mill operating past its economic viability, to protect jobs in a town that had no other major employer, to balance family legacy against financial reality. But it was the journals from 1990 to 1993 that revealed what Samuel had been protecting. The DoD contracts had involved producing secure document paper, specialized stock used for classified materials that included chemical markers and security features that made forgery nearly impossible. The mill had produced paper for intelligence agencies, for military command documents, for materials so sensitive that their mere existence was classified. When the contracts ended in 1993, the government had faced a problem. Thousands of pounds of unused secure paper remained at the mill, along with production samples, chemical formulations, and documentation of the security features built into the paper. Transporting it risked exposure during transfer. Destroying it required procedures that didn't exist at the time. So they'd sealed it in place, assuming the mill would remain abandoned and the materials would remain secure until technology made them obsolete. Samuel had documented his objections extensively, had predicted that sealing classified materials in a failing mill would create problems for future property owners. But the government had overruled him, had sealed the vault and assumed their monitoring would be sufficient. One final journal entry, dated a week before Samuel's death, carried particular weight: "The mill is gone, the jobs are lost, and this building will stand empty for as long as it takes for someone desperate enough to buy it at auction. When that happens, they'll inherit complications I tried to prevent but couldn't. I'm leaving this documentation in the hope that whoever purchases this property will understand they're not responsible for the government's decision to abandon classified materials here. If the FBI comes asking questions, remind them that sealing this vault was their choice, not ours, and that any consequences follow from their decisions, not from whoever was desperate enough to buy an abandoned mill because they had nowhere else to go." Ryan photographed the entry, understanding that Samuel had spent his final days trying to protect people he'd never meet from complications he'd been forced to leave behind. The mill wasn't just an abandoned building, it was a monument to the ways government decisions created burdens for people who had no say in those decisions and couldn't afford their consequences. When Ryan returned to Tom's house, Agent Chin was waiting in her unmarked sedan. Her expression suggested she'd found what she was looking for, and what she'd found had created problems beyond simple inventory verification. "The vault's contents are secure," she said without preamble. "But we have a complication. The materials inside are more sensitive than our records indicated. They can't remain at the mill under current circumstances. They need to be relocated to a secure federal facility." "That sounds like your problem, not mine." "It becomes your problem because the relocation requires environmental permits, security clearances for the moving team, and coordination with multiple agencies. That process will take months, possibly longer. During that time, the vault needs to remain secured and monitored." Ryan felt exhaustion settle over him like weight. "What are you asking?" "We need your cooperation to establish temporary federal custody of the vault area while we arrange relocation. That means allowing our monitoring equipment to remain in place, agreeing not to interfere with the secure area, and accepting certain restrictions on your use of the property." Chin paused. "In exchange, we're prepared to compensate you for the complications. $50,000, paid immediately, with additional payments if the relocation timeline extends beyond 6 months. $50,000. More money than Ryan had seen in 2 years, enough to stabilize their situation, enough to give Ben the kind of security a 6-year-old shouldn't have to live without. But accepting it meant acknowledging that his property came with permanent federal oversight, that he'd bought shelter that included surveillance and restrictions and the constant presence of complications he'd never asked for. "I need to think about it," Ryan said. "You have 24 hours. After that, we proceed with formal legal action to establish federal custody regardless of your cooperation. This way is easier and more profitable for you." After she left, Ryan sat with Tom explaining the offer. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression showing someone processing the kind of choice where every option had costs. "Samuel would tell you to take the money," Tom said finally. "He spent his last years fighting battles that couldn't be won, protecting principle at the expense of practical survival. It didn't save the mill, didn't protect the jobs, just left him dying alone in an empty building. You've got a son who needs stability more than he needs his father to make symbolic stands against federal overreach. But if I accept federal money for custody of materials they abandoned here, I'm legitimizing their decision to leave classified materials in a mill they knew would be foreclosed. I'm letting them escape accountability for creating this situation." "Yeah, you are. But you're also feeding your kid and keeping a roof over his head. Sometimes that matters more than principle." Tom paused. "Samuel learned that too late. Don't make his mistakes." That night, Ryan lay awake in the guest room listening to Ben breathe beside him, thinking about choices and compromises and the ways desperation shaped decisions that pride would have rejected. The mill had given him shelter when he'd had nowhere else to go. But that shelter came with complications that made simple survival an act of federal negotiation. By morning, he'd made his decision. He called Agent Chen and accepted the terms, $50,000 for temporary federal custody, with the understanding that the vault area remained under government control until the materials could be properly relocated. The money appeared in his account within 48 hours, more money than he'd ever seen at once, enough to transform desperation into possibility. But it came with the knowledge that he'd sold something more important than property rights. He'd surrendered the principle that people who inherited government problems shouldn't have to negotiate for permission to survive them. Ben asked what the money meant, whether they could afford school lunches now and maybe new shoes that didn't have holes. Ryan told him yes, they could afford those things and more. He didn't tell him about the cost of that security, about the federal monitoring equipment now installed in their home, about the ways accepting help came with strings that bound you to obligations you couldn't fully understand until they pulled tight. The mill waited, patient and watching, its secrets partially revealed but protected still by agreements and compensation and the grinding reality that survival sometimes required compromising principles you couldn't afford to defend. The $50,000 changed everything and nothing at once. Ryan paid off the motel's debt and reclaimed their belongings from storage, established a bank account that didn't immediately overdraft, bought Ben new clothes that fit and shoes without holes. But the money came with awareness that their security was built on federal oversight, on agreements that gave government agents access to their home whenever they determined monitoring required it. The mill's office building became genuinely livable over the following months. Ryan hired contractors to repair the roof completely, to replace broken windows with modern energy-efficient units, to install proper plumbing and electrical systems in the sections they actually used. The federal money covered basics, and Ryan found construction work again once he had an address to put on applications and wasn't interviewing while worrying about where he'd sleep that night. But he was always aware of the monitoring equipment in the sealed vault area, of the fact that federal agents had keys to sections of his building, of the compromise he'd made between principle and survival. Tom visited regularly, helping with repairs and gradually revealing more about Samuel Brennan and the mill's history. "My uncle believed in honest work above everything," Tom explained one afternoon while they were replacing rotted floorboards in what had been the mill manager's office. "He kept this mill running 5 years past when any reasonable businessman would have closed it, paid employees from his own savings when orders dried up, chose community responsibility over personal profit until there was no profit left to sacrifice. But he died alone in an empty building," Ryan said, understanding he was really asking whether Samuel's choices had been worth their cost. "He did. And I think he knew, toward the end, that martyring yourself for principle doesn't actually save anything except maybe your sense of moral superiority." Tom paused. "But he also left documentation that protected you when the FBI came asking questions. He could have just sealed that vault and said nothing, let future owners deal with complications he wouldn't live to see. Instead, he documented everything, left a paper trail that made clear the government's responsibility. That paper trail is why they paid me. They didn't want Samuel's journals becoming public, didn't want to explain why they'd sealed classified materials in a foreclosed mill." "Exactly. Samuel's last gift wasn't the building, it was the leverage to negotiate with people who expected you to have none." Tom set down his hammer. "You think you compromised principle by accepting their money. But what Samuel taught me before he died was that surviving to fight another day matters more than dying for positions you can't defend. You took their money and got your son stable. That's not compromise, that's strategy." Over the following year, Ryan learned more about the mill's history through Samuel's journals and through conversations with former employees Tom connected him with. The mill had employed 200 people at its peak, had been the economic foundation for Millbrook through most of the 20th century. Its closure had hollowed out the town, had sent families elsewhere looking for work, had left behind the kind of economic scars that took generations to heal. But the mill had also been part of industrial processes that had polluted the river, had used chemicals that had contaminated soil, had represented the costs of manufacturing that communities bore long after profits had moved elsewhere. The environmental liens Ryan had inherited weren't just bureaucratic nuisance, they were recognition of real damage that required real remediation. The federal government's removal of the classified materials took 14 months instead of the projected 6. During that time, Ryan watched agents in unmarked vehicles arrive regularly, monitored the vault area through security systems he couldn't access, lived with the constant awareness that his home was also a federal operations site. But the extended timeline meant extended payments, $50,000 initially, then another $20,000 at 6 months, another $30,000 when the removal finally happened. By the time the vault was empty and the monitoring equipment removed, Ryan had received over $100,000 in federal compensation. The money should have felt like windfall, but it carried weight that made simple celebration impossible. Agent Chen visited for the final inspection, her expression showing something that might have been respect or might have been acknowledgement of complexity. "The materials are relocated," she said, standing in the office that overlooked the river where paper mill waste had once flowed untreated. "The vault's been neutralized, monitoring equipment removed. You have full access to your property now, no more restrictions. But you'll keep this location in your database. If another mill with sealed materials goes to auction, you'll know to call immediately." "Yes, we will. Your cooperation helped us develop better protocols for handling legacy classified sites." Chen paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Mitchell, you handled an impossible situation better than most people would have." Samuel Brennan left you a mess, and you navigated it without compromising security or your integrity. I took money from the government that shouldn't have left classified materials here in the first place. That feels like compromised integrity. You accepted compensation for burdens you didn't create and couldn't refuse. That's not compromise, that's survival. She handed him a final document. If you're ever asked about the classified materials, this letter confirms you cooperated fully with federal authorities, that no security violations occurred, that you have no ongoing obligations or restrictions. It's protection, in case questions come up later. After she left, Ryan stood in the empty vault area, just a concrete room now, stripped of its federal importance, returned to being simple basement space. Ben found him there, his 7-year-old face showing the kind of thoughtfulness that came from a childhood spent watching adults navigate complicated situations. Is the secret room not secret anymore? Ben asked. It's not secret, and it's not special. Just an empty room in a building we're fixing up. But it paid for my school clothes and our food in fixing the roof. Ryan pulled his son close, feeling the weight of lessons Ben was learning about survival and compromise and the ways desperation shaped choices pride wouldn't have made. Yeah, buddy. It did. Sometimes the complications turn out to be blessings if you're willing to work with them instead of fighting them. The environmental cleanup began the following spring, state EPA working with Ryan to address the chemical contamination from decades of paper processing. The federal compensation covered most of the costs, and state grants covered the rest, programs designed to help property owners deal with industrial legacy pollution they'd inherited rather than created. The process took 2 years, slowly transforming sections of the mill from toxic to safe. Contaminated soil was removed and replaced, chemical storage areas were decontaminated, the pulping rooms where the worst exposure had occurred were sealed and marked for future remediation when funding allowed. But the office building and the administrative wings were cleared completely, declared safe for full occupancy. Ryan had made a home from necessity, but now he had a home by choice, cleaned, restored, genuinely livable space in a building that carried a century of industrial history. Tom helped Ryan understand that the mill's value went beyond shelter. This building represents something important, Tom explained while they were converting one wing into a small museum documenting the mill's history. It's proof that American manufacturing was real, employed real people, built real communities. Most of these mills were demolished or left to collapse. That you've preserved this one matters beyond just giving yourself a place to live. They'd found photographs in Samuel's papers showing the mill at peak operation, workers at the pulping stations, the loading docks busy with trucks, the town's main street thriving when the mill provided steady employment. Ryan created exhibits showing that history, documenting the rise and fall of American paper manufacturing, honoring the people who'd built livelihoods from industrial work that had moved overseas. The museum was small, just a few rooms, but it drew visitors, former mill workers sharing stories, historians documenting industrial heritage, students learning about economic transitions that had reshaped rural communities. Ryan charged nothing for admission, considering it part of what he owed to Samuel's memory and to the community that had formed around this building. Ben grew from 7 to 9 during this transformation, his childhood shaped by living in a renovated mill, by learning about industrial history, by understanding that their home had been workplace for hundreds of people across generations. He helped with the museum, asked questions about the machinery and processes, developed an interest in engineering that Ryan encouraged through library books and online videos. Do you ever wish we lived in a normal house? Ryan asked one evening while they were eating dinner in the apartment he'd created in the mill's administrative wing. Ben considered this seriously. I like that our house used to be something important. That people worked here and made things and our home has history. Normal houses don't have that. The wisdom in his answer made Ryan recognize that Ben had learned something valuable from their desperate circumstances, that worth came from what you built with what you were given, not from waiting for perfect circumstances that might never arrive. Tom's family became surrogate relatives, Helen treating Ryan and Ben as extensions of her household, their daughter becoming like an older sister to Ben. The connection went beyond simple friendship into the kind of family you chose rather than inherited, built from shared experiences and mutual support through difficult times. On an autumn afternoon 5 years after buying the mill, Ryan received a call from a development company interested in purchasing the property. They'd seen the museum, had heard about the environmental cleanup, thought the riverfront location had potential for mixed-use development that would bring jobs and housing to Millbrook. The offer was substantial, $400,000 for the building and land, with the understanding that they'd demolish the mill and build something modern. The money would allow Ryan to buy a regular house, to establish security beyond what his construction work and the federal compensation had provided, to give Ben the kind of stable childhood that didn't involve living in a renovated industrial building. Ryan told them he'd think about it, then sat in Samuel's former office looking at photographs of the mill at peak operation, reading journal entries about stubborn commitment to keeping the mill running when every financial indicator said to close. One entry from Samuel's final months seemed to speak directly to Ryan's decision. I spent 40 years fighting to keep this mill operational past its economic viability. I told myself I was protecting jobs and community, honoring family legacy, standing for principle against corporate consolidation. But the truth I'm only now admitting is that I was afraid. Afraid that closing the mill meant admitting my generation had failed to adapt, that we'd valued nostalgia over evolution, that sometimes the best way to honor what was built is to let it transform into what's needed next. Ryan read the entry 3 times, understanding that Samuel had learned too late that preservation and transformation weren't opposites. The mill mattered, but what it became mattered more than what it had been. He called the development company and declined their offer, but proposed something different. They could lease portions of the mill's industrial wings, the sections that were cleaned but unused, for renovation into commercial and light manufacturing space. Ryan would retain ownership in the museum, they'd handle development and tenant management, and the building would serve present needs while preserving its history. The company's president was skeptical initially, had expected a simple purchase, but became intrigued by the hybrid model. It's unusual, he admitted during the negotiation meeting. But it might actually work better than demolition. The historic character adds value if we market it correctly. They signed a partnership agreement that gave the development company long-term lease rights while preserving Ryan's ownership and the museum's operation. The arrangement brought stable income beyond what Ryan could earn from construction work, while ensuring the mill remained standing and purposeful. Tom attended the signing, his expression showing pride that went beyond simple support into recognition of something larger. Samuel would approve, he said afterward. Not because you preserved the mill exactly as it was, but because you found a way to make it useful again. That's better than fighting to keep it frozen in time until it collapsed from neglect. Ben was 11 now, old enough to understand the significance of the partnership, to recognize that his father had chosen a middle path between selling out and holding on at any cost. So our house is also a business now, he asked. Our house is part of a building that's becoming useful again. The museum stays, we stay, but other parts of the mill will have people working in them again. Different work than paper manufacturing, but still honest work, still building community. Like Mr. Brennan wanted. Yeah, buddy. Like Mr. Brennan wanted. The renovation of the industrial wings took 3 years, slowly transforming toxic ruins into clean workspace. The first tenants were a craft brewery that appreciated the building's industrial character, a furniture maker who used reclaimed wood, a tech startup that wanted office space with history. They paid rent to the development company, which paid Ryan his percentage, creating income that accumulated into genuine security. By the time Ben was 14, the mill housed 15 businesses employing 70 people, not the 200 it had employed at peak, but enough to matter to Millbrook's economy, enough to bring life back to a building that had been dead for 30 years. Ryan walked the property regularly, checking on tenants, maintaining the museum, showing visitors the millstones and pulping equipment that had been preserved as industrial artifacts. The building breathed differently now, not with the industrial intensity of its operational years, but with the steady purpose of space being used well, of history being honored while serving present needs. Agent Chen visited one final time, not for official business but for what she called closure on a case that taught us better practices. She walked through the museum, examined the renovated industrial wings, saw what Ryan had built from the complications she'd helped him navigate. "This is remarkable," she said, standing in the brewery where the pulping room had once operated. "Most classified legacy sites either stay abandoned or get demolished. You found a way to preserve history while eliminating the problems." "I compromised principle to survive. Then I compromised again to build something sustainable." "That's not remarkable, it's just pragmatic." "It's both. You could have taken that development company's initial offer, sold the building and walked away with money and no complications. Instead you created something that matters beyond just personal profit." Chin paused. "For what it's worth, the protocols we developed from your case have helped us handle 6 other legacy sites more appropriately. Your cooperation created changes that will protect other property owners from being blindsided the way you were." After she left, Ryan stood alone in the museum, surrounded by photographs of workers who'd built livelihoods from paper manufacturing, looking at equipment that had processed millions of pounds of pulpwood into paper that had served a nation. The mill had represented honest work and environmental damage in equal measure, had employed communities while polluting rivers, had been both blessing and burden across generations. He'd inherited the burden without the blessing, had purchased shelter that came with toxic legacy and federal complications. But he'd transformed that inheritance into something that honored both what the mill had been and what it could become: preserved history, useful workspace, proof that buildings could serve new purposes without erasing what they'd meant before. Ben found him there as evening light filtered through windows that had been restored to lead and brightness the mill's operational years had never prioritized. His son was taller now, showing the first signs of the teenager he'd become, carrying the thoughtfulness that came from childhood spent watching his father build from desperate circumstances. "Are you glad we bought this place?" Ben asked. "Even with all the complications?" Ryan thought about the question, about eviction and homelessness in the auction bid that had been desperation disguised as strategy, about federal agents and classified materials and the compromise that had kept them fed and housed, about preservation and transformation and the slow work of making something useful from what you'd inherited. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm glad. Not because it was easy or because I made perfect choices, but because we survived and built something and you grew up learning that sometimes the best you can do is work with what you're given, even when what you're given is complicated and imperfect. Like the mill. Like the mill. Like us. Like most things worth preserving, not perfect, not simple, but real and useful and worth the work it takes to keep them standing." They stood together in the museum that had been Samuel Brennan's office, in the building that had been paper mill and federal problem and toxic ruin and desperate shelter, watching through restored windows as the river flowed past the mill just as it had for over a century, carrying water that had powered industry and borne pollution, and witnessed the slow work of communities adapting to changes they hadn't chosen. The mill stood solid in the evening light, its industrial bones repurposed but not forgotten, its history preserved while serving present needs, proof that survival sometimes required accepting help even when help came with strings, that building from compromised positions was better than refusing to build at all, that legacy was shaped not by refusing imperfection but by working with what you were given until it became something worth passing forward. The river remembered everything: the decades of industrial operation, the chemicals that had flowed untreated, the cleanup that had transformed poison into safety, the slow breathing of a building returning to life. It would continue flowing long after everyone currently connected to the mill was gone, patient witness to the work of preservation and transformation, to the stubborn human insistence that what was built could be reborn if people were willing to do the difficult work of accepting what they'd inherited and making it serve purposes its builders never imagined. Ryan locked the museum as darkness settled over the mill, its lights glowing warm from windows that had been dark for 30 years, its spaces filled with businesses and purpose and the steady rhythm of work being done. He'd bought the building for $400 because he'd had nowhere else to go, had discovered complications that had tested every principle he thought he held, had compromised and negotiated and built from positions that pride would have rejected. But Ben had grown up stable, had learned lessons about pragmatism and persistence, had seen his father transform desperation into foundation for whatever came next. The mill stood as monument to that transformation, to the idea that sometimes inheritance meant accepting what you were given, complications and all, and building from there rather than waiting for circumstances that were pure and uncomplicated and never actually arrived. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you built from it, not what you refused to compromise but what you managed to preserve while adapting to reality, not the perfection you demanded but the usefulness you created from imperfect circumstances through patient work and stubborn refusal to let complications destroy what mattered. The mill breathed in the night air, alive again after decades of death, serving purposes its builders hadn't imagined but would have recognized as honest work, proof that buildings and people could survive their own ruins if they were willing to accept help even when help wasn't pure, to compromise when compromise meant survival, to build from whatever foundation desperation provided until that foundation became something solid enough to stand on. 15 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the mill the way water shapes stone. Ryan watched Ben grow from the 6-year-old boy who'd stood beside him at a desperate auction to a 21-year-old man preparing for graduate school in industrial preservation, his undergraduate thesis having examined how historic manufacturing sites could be transformed into community assets rather than simply demolished or abandoned. The mill had transformed with them. What had been toxic ruin was now thriving mixed-use complex, the building housing 23 businesses employing 140 people, not the 200 workers of its peak, but enough to matter to Millbrook's economy, enough to have sparked revival in a town that had been slowly dying when Ryan first arrived. The environmental cleanup had been completed 5 years earlier, the last contaminated sections remediated and cleared, the property finally free of the toxic legacy it had carried for decades. Ryan had used the income from the lease agreements carefully, investing in the building's continued maintenance, in the museum's expansion, in establishing a foundation that provided grants to other towns trying to preserve industrial heritage rather than erase it. The federal compensation that had once felt like compromise now looked like seed money for something Samuel Brennan would have recognized as honoring the mill's purpose, not by freezing it in the past, but by ensuring it continued serving the community it had been built for. But more than the physical transformation, the mill had become proof that desperate circumstances could lead to unexpected legacy if you were willing to work with what you inherited rather than fighting for what you wished you'd been given. Ryan had bought the building because he'd had nowhere else to go. Now it stood as monument to the idea that survival and principle didn't have to be opposites, that you could compromise your way through impossible situations and still build something that mattered. Tom Brennan had become more than friend and advisor. He'd become the family connection Ryan had lost when his wife died and his own family had drifted into estrangement. Helen had watched Ben grow up alongside their own children, had celebrated his graduations and achievements with the pride of someone who'd watched him transform from scared 6-year-old to confident young man. Samuel would have loved this, Tom said one afternoon while they stood in the museum watching a tour group learn about paper manufacturing history. Not because you preserved the mill exactly as it was, but because you found a way to make it matter again. He spent his last years fighting to keep the building frozen in time. You've shown it can evolve and still honor what it was. I had help I couldn't refuse and made compromises he probably wouldn't have made. He made compromises too, he just made them too late to matter. The DoD contracts, the decision to let classified materials stay sealed here, the choices to keep running the mill past any reasonable economic justification. Those were all compromises between what he believed and what circumstances demanded. Tom paused. The difference is you compromised early enough that you had time to build from those compromises rather than dying defending positions that couldn't be held. The museum had grown significantly over the years, now occupying the entire administrative wing with exhibits documenting not just paper manufacturing but the broader story of American industrial transformation. Students visited regularly, researchers studying economic transitions came to examine the mill as case study, former employees brought their grandchildren to show them where honest work had built communities before globalization changed everything. Ryan had tracked down dozens of former mill workers, had recorded their oral histories, had created exhibits honoring the people who'd built livelihoods from industrial labor. One section displayed photographs of workers at their stations, their names and stories preserved, recognition that the mill's value had never been just economic but human, families supported, children educated, communities sustained through the dignity of regular employment. Ben had helped build that section during his undergraduate years, had interviewed former workers himself, had developed his passion for industrial preservation through understanding how buildings like the mill connected past generations to present communities. His graduate school applications had all focused on adaptive reuse of historic industrial sites, on finding ways to preserve heritage while serving modern needs. "I want to help other towns do what you did here," Ben had told Ryan when explaining his academic focus. "Towns that have old mills or factories they can't afford to maintain but can't afford to lose. There should be models for transformation that don't require federal complications or desperate circumstances to make them work." His clarity of purpose reminded Ryan of Samuel's dedication to the mill, but without the stubborn resistance to adaptation that had made Samuel's final years a losing battle against inevitable change. Ben had absorbed lessons about pragmatism and persistence, about building from what you inherited rather than mourning what had been lost, about the value of working with circumstances rather than fighting them when fighting wouldn't change outcomes. The brewery that had been the first tenant had become regional success, their beer named after Samuel Brennan and marketed as Paper Mill Pale Ale, brewed where honest work built communities. They'd hired 23 employees from Millbrook, had become the kind of anchor business that created spillover effects, restaurants opening to serve brewery visitors, shops catering to tourists who came for the beer and stayed to explore the museum. The tech startup had evolved into an established company with 40 employees, their choice to remain in the mill despite outgrowing the space driven by appreciation for the building's character and the story it represented. Their CEO had given interviews about how the mill's industrial history inspired their work ethic, how being surrounded by evidence of past generations' labor reminded them that their innovations built on foundations others had laid. Ryan walked the property regularly, checking on tenants and maintaining the common areas, showing visitors the preserved machinery and explaining how paper had been manufactured before digital technology made certain aspects of the industry obsolete. He'd learned the technical details through research and conversations with former workers, had become expert enough to teach others about processes most people had never considered. On a warm evening in late spring, 20 years after purchasing the mill for $400, Ryan stood alone in what had been Samuel Brennan's office, now the museum's centerpiece. The room had been restored to something approximating its appearance during the mill's operational years, Samuel's desk refinished and preserved, filing cabinets that had once held production records now holding archival materials, photographs on the walls showing the mill at various stages of its 112-year operational history. A new exhibit had just opened, documenting the classified materials controversy and the federal compensation that had helped save the building. Ryan had debated including it, had worried it might feel like airing grievances or seeking sympathy. But Ben had convinced him that the full story mattered, that people needed to understand how government decisions created burdens for property owners, how federal obligations could complicate simple survival, how accepting help sometimes meant compromising principles you'd have preferred to defend. The exhibit included Samuel's journal entries about objecting to the sealed vault, Agent Chen's letters confirming Ryan's cooperation, documentation of the federal payments and the eventual material relocation. But it also included context, explanation of why secure materials had been sealed, recognition that the decisions had made sense within their historical moment even if they'd created problems later, acknowledgement that compromise had ultimately served everyone better than confrontation would have. Tom found him there as evening light painted the office in amber tones. His friend was older now, showing the wear of years but also the satisfaction of someone who'd helped right wrongs his family had inadvertently created. "The new exhibit is good," Tom said. "Honest about the complications without being bitter. That's hard to achieve. Samuel's journals made it easier. He documented everything so carefully that the story told itself. I just had to present what he'd already recorded. He'd be proud of what you've built. More importantly, he'd recognize it as what he was trying to protect, not the mill exactly as it was, but the idea that buildings and communities and honest work matter enough to fight for, even when fighting means adapting rather than resisting." After Tom left, Ryan sat at Samuel's desk thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The eviction notice that had started everything. The desperate auction bid made with money that should have kept them housed another week. The discovery of complications he couldn't have anticipated and couldn't refuse. The federal agents and classified materials and the compromise that had felt like surrender but had become foundation for everything that followed. He pulled out the first journal he'd kept, started when Ben was 7 and they were living in the office building with camping equipment and hope that bordered on delusion. The early entries documented fear and uncertainty, recorded daily struggles with money and housing and the weight of single parenthood when every decision felt consequential. But they also documented small victories: Ben's first day at the local school, the first tenant signing a lease, the gradual transformation of toxic ruin into useful space. Reading those entries now, 15 years later, Ryan recognized how much had changed and how much hadn't. The fear had receded as security accumulated, but the awareness that circumstances could shift remained. The money had made survival easier but hadn't eliminated the need for careful choices and patient work. The mill had become home and business and legacy, but it required constant maintenance and attention to remain all those things. Ben appeared in the doorway, carrying boxes of his belongings that he was moving back to the mill for the summer before graduate school started in the fall. He'd spent the academic year at university housing, but the mill remained home in ways dormitories never would. "Found your old journals," Ben said, setting down the boxes. "The ones from when we first moved in. You kept them?" "Wanted to remember what it felt like when everything was uncertain. Didn't want success, if it came, to make me forget how close we were to losing everything." Ben sat beside his father, reading through entries that documented their first months in the mill. His face showed recognition of events he partly remembered and partly had been too young to fully understand. "You wrote about the federal agents coming, about being scared they'd take the building, about feeling like you'd traded principle for security." Ben looked up. "Do you still feel that way?" "Sometimes. But I've also learned that principle without survival is just martyrdom with better press. Samuel died defending the mill from change that would have happened anyway. You grew up stable because I accepted help even when accepting it meant compromising positions I'd have preferred to defend." Ryan paused. "I'm not sure which choice was more principled, honestly. But I know which one gave you the chance to become who you are." Ben was quiet for a long moment, processing wisdom that came from years of watching his father make difficult choices. The people Samuel employed, the ones in the oral histories, they all said he was a good boss but a lonely man. That he put the mill before relationships, before family, before everything except making sure the work continued even when continuing made no economic sense. He did. And he died alone because of it. But we didn't. We've got Tom and Helen and their kids, we've got the community that's formed around this building, we've got each other." Ben smiled slightly. "Maybe that's what using the mill better than Samuel did means. Not just restoring the building, but making sure it connects people instead of isolating them." The wisdom in his son's observation made Ryan recognize how much Ben had absorbed from growing up in the mill, from watching compromise and adaptation transform desperation into foundation. He'd learned lessons Ryan had been too close to the situation to articulate clearly, had synthesized their experience into understanding that would shape whatever work he did with other historic properties. As darkness settled over the mill, father and son stood at the windows overlooking the river that had powered the building's operations for over a century. The water flowed as it always had, carrying memories of industrial use and environmental damage and slow cleanup that had transformed poison into safety. The mill's lights glowed warm in the evening, illuminating spaces where people worked at businesses that hadn't existed when the building was constructed but that served the same fundamental purpose: creating employment, building community, proving that honest work mattered. Ryan thought about Samuel Brennan's final journal entry, about his recognition that he'd valued principle over adaptation, isolation over connection, symbolic stands over practical survival. Those choices had left Samuel dying alone in an empty building, had created complications for whoever inherited what he'd tried to protect. But those complications had also created opportunity, had forced Ryan to develop resilience and creativity, had taught Ben lessons about pragmatism that would serve him throughout his life. The mill's toxic legacy and federal entanglements had been burden Ryan hadn't wanted, but working with them rather than fighting them had produced something Samuel's stubbornness never could have: a building that served present needs while honoring past purposes, that connected people rather than defending against them, that adapted rather than resisted and lived because of that adaptation. The foundation Ryan had established gave its first major grant that fall, $50,000 to a small town in Ohio trying to preserve a shuttered textile mill that had employed 300 people before automation and foreign competition made domestic production unviable. The grant would fund initial cleanup and structural assessment, would help the town develop a business plan for adaptive reuse similar to what Ryan had achieved at Riverside Mill. Ben traveled to Ohio to consult on the project, bringing expertise that combined his academic training with practical knowledge from growing up in a restored mill. He sent Ryan photographs of the textile building, for stories of brick that looked simultaneously solid and fragile, a monument to industrial era that had employed communities before economic forces moved on. "It reminds me of our mill before the restoration," Ben texted with the photos. "Everything that made it valuable buried under decades of abandonment and contamination. But the bones are good. If they're willing to work with what they have instead of waiting for perfect circumstances, they can build something that matters." Ryan showed the message to Tom, both of them recognizing Ben's unconscious echo of the lessons they'd learned through restoring Riverside Mill. "The bones are good" became their motto for the foundation's work, identifying industrial buildings that had solid structure beneath their decay, helping communities see potential rather than just problems, providing resources that made restoration possible rather than just aspirational. Over the following years, the foundation helped preserve 9 industrial buildings across New England and the Midwest. Not all succeeded, some towns lacked the resources or vision to complete the work, some buildings proved too damaged for economically viable restoration. But 6 became thriving community assets, employing people and serving purposes that honored their industrial heritage while adapting to modern needs. On a cool October morning, 25 years after Ryan had purchased the mill at auction, they held a ceremony marking the building's official designation as a National Historic Landmark. The honor recognized not just the mill's industrial significance but the successful transformation from toxic ruin to community asset, the model it provided for other towns facing similar preservation challenges. State and federal officials attended, including Agent Chen, retired now but still interested in the case that had changed federal protocols for handling classified materials in abandoned facilities. She spoke briefly about how Ryan's cooperation had led to better practices, how other property owners had been spared similar complications because the government had learned from mistakes made at Riverside Mill. But the most meaningful speakers were former mill workers, now in their 70s and 80s, who'd seen the building at peak operation and had watched its decline and were witnessing its rebirth. They spoke about honest work and community purpose, about the dignity of regular employment and the pain of watching industries disappear, about gratitude that the building that had employed them now employed a new generation in different ways. Ben gave the closing remarks, his speech focusing on legacy and adaptation, on the responsibility each generation had to work with what they inherited rather than simply mourning what had been lost. He talked about his father's desperate purchase, about complications that had become opportunities, about the slow work of transformation that honored the past while serving the present. "This building represents more than industrial history," Ben said, standing before the crowd gathered in the museum that had once been Samuel Brennan's office. "It represents what happens when desperate circumstances meet stubborn determination, when people accept help even when help comes with complications, when communities value preservation enough to invest in transformation rather than choosing demolition because demolition is simpler." After the ceremony, Ryan walked the property alone, following paths he'd walked thousands of times over 25 years. The mill breathed with purpose, its spaces filled with people working and creating and building livelihoods from buildings their grandparents' generation had used for different work but the same fundamental purpose: earning living, supporting families, contributing to community. He stood at the river's edge where industrial waste had once flowed untreated, where environmental damage had accumulated across decades, where cleanup had slowly transformed poison into safety. The water ran clear now, fish visible in its shallows, proof that even severe damage could be healed if people were willing to invest in the slow work of remediation. The mill rose behind him, solid and purposeful, its brick walls holding stories that spanned over a century, the workers who'd built livelihoods from paper manufacturing, Samuel Brennan's stubborn defense of the building past economic viability, the federal complications that had protected classified materials for 30 years, Ryan's desperate purchase and slow transformation of ruins into community asset. All of it had been necessary: the industrial success and environmental damage, the economic decline and abandonment, the complications and compromises, the patient work of restoration and adaptation. The mill stood as monument to the idea that buildings and communities could survive their own failures if people were willing to accept what they'd inherited, work with circumstances rather than fight them, build from imperfect foundations until those foundations became solid enough to support what came next. Ben joined him as afternoon light painted the mill in autumn colors, both of them quiet in the way people are when they understand they're witnessing something larger than themselves. The building their desperate circumstances had given them had become legacy they were passing forward, proof that survival and principle could coexist if you were willing to compromise tactically while remaining committed strategically to what mattered. Samuel wrote that he hoped whoever bought the mill would understand they weren't responsible for government decisions that created complications here, Ryan said. But I think what he really hoped was that someone would care enough to work through those complications rather than walking away because working through them was difficult. You cared because you didn't have anywhere else to go. At first, yeah. But somewhere along the way it became about more than just survival. It became about honoring what Samuel protected, about proving that buildings like this matter enough to save even when saving them is expensive and complicated and requires compromising positions you'd prefer to defend. They stood together as evening settled over the mill, watching lights appear in windows where businesses worked late, where people created and built and earned livings from spaces that had been dead for 30 years before desperate circumstances had led a broke single father to purchase them for $400 at an auction where no one else bid. The river flowed past, patient witness to industrial rise and environmental damage and slow cleanup that had restored its health. The mill stood solid, transformed from toxic monument to economic decline into thriving proof that communities could preserve heritage while adapting to present needs. And Ryan, who had bought the building because he'd had nowhere else to go, understood that sometimes the best things came from worst circumstances if you were willing to work with what you'd been given rather than fighting for what you wished you had. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you built from it, not the perfection you demanded but the usefulness you created from imperfect circumstances, not the principles you died defending but the practical compromises that kept you alive long enough to build something worth defending. Samuel Brennan had learned that too late. Ryan had learned it early enough that Ben had grown up understanding that survival and principle weren't opposites, that accepting help didn't mean surrendering values, that sometimes the bravest thing was adapting rather than resisting when resistance would destroy what you were trying to protect. The mill breathed in the evening air, alive with purpose and memory and the steady work of people who understood that honest labor still mattered even when the specific forms of that labor had evolved beyond what the building's designers had imagined. The bones were good, and from good bones you could build anything if you were patient and stubborn and willing to compromise your way through complications that would have defeated those who demanded purity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.